A new study says America's post-9/11 wars have led to millions of deaths and continuing health, economic and environmental challenges. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu and this is The Heat. Following the attack on the World Trade Center in 2001, the United States launched what it called the Global War on Terror. In the intervening years, at least 4.5 million people have died, roughly 1 million from direct combat and the remaining 3.5 million indirectly, stemming from the conflict's destruction of economies, public services and the environment. That's the conclusion of a new report from Brown University's Costs of War project. More than 20 years later, it's a price that many nations besides the United States continue to pay. CGTN's Jim Spellman has more in this report.
Following the terrorist attacks against the United States on September 11, 2001, the U.S. launched a series of military actions. First in Afghanistan that October, then less than 2 years later in 2003, the so-called shock and awe assault on Iraq. The conflict spilled over into Pakistan, Syria, Yemen, and other countries. The toll of those wars has been staggering, accounting for 4.5 million direct and indirect deaths, according to new research from the Costs of War project at Brown University.
Though the U.S. officially ended its Iraq war in 2011, the repercussions of the 2003 invasion and subsequent occupation continue to have an enormous human, social, economic, and environmental toll.
The Costs of War project estimates more than 900,000 people have been directly killed during those conflicts, while more than 3.5 million have died from indirect causes, including economic hardships, malnutrition, the destruction of health infrastructure, and environmental contamination, as those caught in the wake of war struggle to survive.
It's a story of violence and destruction, of lawlessness and chaos, suffering, loss of life, injuries, destroyed infrastructure, widespread displacement. But at the same time, the story of the invasion and occupation in the last 20 years is also a story of survival, of coping, of resisting, of trying to continue as, with everyday life, with a sense of dignity.
The report notes many warring parties and many intensifying factors have contributed to these deaths, and the report does not attribute direct responsibility to any single combatant or cause. But many place blame squarely on the shoulders of the U.S.
So the situation in Iraq now is really terrible, and the Iraqis who live in Iraq will live with the consequences of the invasion, sadly. The people who decided to go to war, who wrote articles supporting the war, are going on about their lives and living a very good life. They don't have to live with the consequences of war.
There have been calls for the U.S. to pay direct reparations to those affected by the post-9/11 wars, as well as calls to form some sort of truth and reconciliation panel to hold U.S. policymakers accountable. But perhaps not surprisingly, so far, those efforts have failed to gain traction here in the United States. Jim Spellman, CGTN, Washington.
Well, there is much to talk about. Let's get to our panel. Khalil Jahshan is Executive Director of the Arab Center here in Washington, D.C. Aaron Mate hosts Pushback with Aaron Mate on the Grayzone. Also with us is Saeed Khan. He's an Associate Professor of Near Eastern Studies at Wayne State University. And Brian Becker is the Executive Director of the Answer Coalition. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. Brian Becker, more than 4.5 million people killed, 1 million of them in direct fighting, as we just heard. And as we also heard, the impact of these wars continue to be felt to this day. Question is, what was achieved?
Well, the U.S. succeeded in creating an ocean of misery for the people who lived in those countries. It also created an ocean of resistance, really, because no people wants to live under foreign occupation or the consequences of divide and conquer strategies whereby countries that had a unitary system like Iraq were divided intentionally along religious lines, along sectarian lines. You think about the situation not only with those who have died and the loved ones, but all of the people who were tortured. I mean, the U.S. set up black site torture centers all around the world. And of course, we remember Abu Ghraib and the terrible torture imposed on Iraqi prisoners. And the U.S. government officials who did all of this, much of it premised on lies, on fabrications, intentionally misleading the public. As your report said, they have gone on with impunity. As a matter of fact, they've gotten quite rich. They make speeches, they write books, they're referred to as eminent statesmen. This entire policy has been a complete catastrophe for the people of the region. And frankly, I don't think it put the United States or its geostrategic positioning in a stronger spot either. As a matter of fact, I think Obama, when he announced the pivot to Asia in 2011, recognized that while the U.S. was bogged down in this killing spree in the Middle East and South Asia, other countries using peaceful means were developing economically. So all around, I would say this has been a terrible catastrophe for the people of the world, of course, the people of the Middle East first and foremost, and for all the American soldiers who died needlessly or had life-changing injuries, again, for nothing. Again, a terrible catastrophe.
Khalil, Jahshan, what the United States called its war on terror began with the invasion of Afghanistan after the 9/11 attacks and then extended to multiple countries, almost all of them Muslim-majority countries. It includes Iraq, Libya, Syria, Pakistan, Somalia, among others. Looking at the Middle East region, what was the impact on those countries, and to what extent did these wars destabilize and continue to destabilize that region?
For one, I think the vicious reaction, if you will, to 9/11 ended up probably creating more damage than we started with, in the sense that not only the cost in human life, the human cost itself, and then the financial cost that we still to pay for, still are paying for today, but even something we rarely talk about, and I think the report really deals with it that extensively, the political cost. In the sense, I think what Brian just referred to quickly a minute ago, in terms of creating an ocean. He said creating an ocean of misery, but it's also created an ocean of enemies. When you look at that area of the world, Anand, today, and have we gained any friends as a result of this war? I doubt it. Our own research, the Arab Opinion Index, which we conduct extensively throughout the region, we had more than 31,000 people surveyed in last year's version of it, shows that over 78% of people in the region consider essentially the U.S. As the most threatening international power to the security and stability of the region. If that was the intended result, we've wasted all kinds of the lives of American soldiers and the resources of this country to do what? Produce more enemies? Mm-hmm. I'm not sure we had that many enemies before. When you ask people about what is the most threatening country to your own country of origin, you get 21%. In the second place, right after Israel, with 38%, considering the U.S. as being the greatest threat to their specific country. That's way more than Russia and way more than Iran, if you could imagine that, where we keep talking about Iran constituting a threat, a vital threat to the region.
Those figures are very important that you cite there, Khalil. And also, you talked about creating more enemies. In many respects, if this was a war against terror, it was counterproductive, wasn't it? Because we had other groups that emerged as well.
It was counterproductive. It did not eliminate terror per se. It did weaken maybe some groups here and there, but essentially it swept the issue under the rug. because we have never been interested, aside from the lies used in justifying the launching of these wars, we were never interested in looking at the causes. We still are not interested in looking at the causes, because somehow decision makers in Washington perceive as studying or looking at the causes of terrorism somehow justifies terror. I don't think so. If we do not understand the phenomenon that we are fighting, we're apt to basically lose the battle and most probably lose the war.
Aaron Mate, great to have you with us. 4.5 million people killed, and that figure is probably higher. But the war also, these wars, I should say, also had a major impact here in the United States. I mean, in addition to the thousands of American servicemen that died in this war, the Harvard Gazette says nearly 2 million U.S. veterans deployed in Iraq and Afghanistan returned with permanent disabilities. And the cost of war, that report that we're talking about, tells us that suicides among active duty personnel and veterans now exceeds 30,000. So how would you assess the impact of these wars here in the United States?
It's incalculable, and then you have to compound that by the fact that you also have all this money that could have been spent on taking care of people's needs at home, giving people health care, which we still don't have in the U.S. That basic right is denied to millions of people. So really, the toll is incalculable, because so much money was devoted to these disastrous foreign wars. And we're still seeing the consequences around the world. I mean, a lot of these wars that began, the consequences are not over. We still have U.S. troops on the ground in Syria, where they're still involved in clashes. And you have entire populations abroad that are suffering not only from the impact of war, but the impact of sanctions that have been imposed on these countries after the war. So, for example, in Syria, after a 10-year war where the U.S. spent billions of dollars trying to overthrow the government, you have now Syria being subjected to the world's harshest sanctions that are designed to help prevent them from rebuilding. So the overall toll is harshest, as Brian said, on the civilians of these countries that have been subjected to these policies. But certainly at home in the U.S., there's a toll as well.
Saeed Khan, 2 years ago, the Taliban returned to power. That's 2 decades after the United States toppled the Taliban in Afghanistan, and that became America's longest war. Let's listen to Stephanie Saville, the co-director of the Costs of War project.
This same scholar, Dr. Dillitsai, talks about, people saying to her, I can't taste my food anymore. In Afghanistan, I don't want to live another day. These kinds of statements are really common. And then there's the infrastructure and the fact that war plunges entire countries into poverty. It's the whole economy gets decimated. People can no longer secure basic livelihood, and that is the biggest, killer, right? Because if you can't afford to buy food, you can't eat, and that has huge consequences for your life and your death. And same, like, you can't afford to take your kid to the doctor if they get sick.
So, Saeed, after 2 decades of war and occupation, the United Nations tells us that 85% of Afghanistan's population is now living in poverty, and 95% don't have enough food. Add to that the fact that the United States took the Afghan money that was in the central bank, according to a report in the Washington Post. In fact, the word the Washington Post used is it stole the money from the Afghan National Treasury. So what is your assessment of what happened?
Well, first of all, I think we have to recognize that American involvement in Afghanistan didn't last just 20 years. It lasted more than 40 years, going all the way back to 1979. The kind of destabilization that occurred in Afghanistan has a longevity that goes well before the advent of the Taliban. And in fact, the Taliban came in much because of that intervention and engagement during the Soviet era that is over there. And again, what we see here is not just the destruction of a country, but the destruction of a civilization, a once very proud and thriving one. The fact that you have this kind of action on the part of the United States, leaving with impunity after entering with impunity, no kind of liability, criminal or otherwise. And then, yes, I think it is most accurate to describe this and to define it as a theft. The fact that we can go ahead and use some terminology about freezing assets and all. But the other criminal and highly politicized action by President Biden of saying, well, this money is actually earmarked for the 9/11 survivors was a rather cynical move in order to curry both public opinion here in the United States and, in a sense, to launder that money when it comes to what were really the intentions of the United States. But after all, after the Iraq and Afghan wars cost conservatively, by most estimates, $6 trillion, the point that Aaron made is very important. What is the opportunity cost of that money having been used in the United States for a myriad different issues? Here it was just the folly of militarism, which not only destroyed those countries, but undermined really America and American confidence around the world.
Brian, one other impact, according to the study, was that the post-9/11 wars displaced at least 38 million people. I mean, that's more than any other conflict in the past 123 years. That's excluding World War II. And, you know, the point was made by you earlier on. I mean, isn't the U.S. responsible for mitigating this, for resettling people in the first instance?
Yeah, this is a really important part of the story. And of course, we have to congratulate Brown University for doing something the U.S. government should have been doing but hasn't been doing, which is counting the number of people who have been harmed, who have been killed, who have been displaced. The U.S. government has a nonchalant attitude towards the impact of its policies on the people who were in targeted countries. When it comes to immigration, as you mentioned, the number of people on the move in the world today, refugees looking for someplace to go, someplace other than home, is now about 60 to 65 million, which is the equivalent number as we're on the move at the end of World War II. And while the U.S. war policy, the endless war policy, or the war on terror, which was simply a banner for endless war, is a principal cause, it's not the only cause, but it's a very important part of the cause. And here you have people whose lives have not only been like displaced, but uprooted. Millions from Iraq who were sent to Jordan or fled to Syria from the first Gulf War. And then millions more who fled after the shock and awe invasion. And then the U.S. bombing of Libya created more refugees. And then the endless nonstop war against Syria that went on since 2011 when President Obama said, Assad must go, as if the U.S. gets to determine who the leaders will be in different countries. More refugees all over Turkey and all over Europe and destabilizing those countries. I mean, here you have the United States acting with such impunity, such lack of accountability, and at the same time, politicians in America then take advantage of people being on the move, seeking asylum, seeking refuge, to blame them because they become a convenient punching bag, a scapegoat for America's own economic problems. I mean, it's a diabolical political system that fails to take responsibility for U.S. misdeeds.
Khalil, you know, as we've also seen, these wars killed millions of women and children. I want to play you a video of one perspective on what this means. Kali Rubai is an anthropologist. She spent a lot of time in Iraq. This is what she saw, and this is what she has to say.
Many of the people that I live and work with, and that's of course not representative of all Iraqis, are nostalgic for a time when Saddam Hussein was in power. And it's not because they loved living under a dictator. By no means is there nostalgia in the emotive sense. There's a nostalgia for a time when people could get access to healthcare and where there was a public sector. The public has been gutted. And what that ends up doing is, for those who can afford to buy out the cost of lack of infrastructure, they can thrive. And for those who can't afford it, which is most people, they languish.
So Khalil, doesn't this just turn everything on its head? I mean, the downfall of Saddam Hussein was celebrated in the West, in Western capitals. But what does it tell us when people actually long for the return to the days when a man was running the country with a brutal fist?
It is indeed worrisome and saddening for those of us who keep track of daily events in countries like Iraq, like Syria, like Yemen, and so on, like Afghanistan. It is depressing to see kind of the results. Frankly, if there is a lesson to be learned, is the fact that it's easy to start wars and it's very difficult to end wars, because wars, in fact, do not end. The only people who feel the end of war are the dead. They are at peace, at least now. But the living do not. Whether it is the living among the victims or the living among the perpetrators of these wars continue to pay a price. So when you listen to these comments about Iraq, for example, there are so many other issues that are not even brought up. Not even in sophisticated and appreciated studies like this. For example, the destruction of the health system. That doesn't stop suddenly when there is a ceasefire. That continues. How many of us know that there are more than 20 different cancers that continue to attack the bodies of children and women and older people and just the general public in Iraq due to the type of weaponry that we used in Iraq? When will that end? That will never end because it's embedded in the system, in the soil of the war theater. And it will continue for hundreds of years to basically cause more and more victims. So, aside from the fact that there is no reconstruction, so to speak, in a serious way, to build these countries, when you look at Iraq and Syria and so on, you see some help coming in, but as we just mentioned a few minutes ago, most of it has been misplaced, most of it has been looted, most of it has been misdirected and pocketed by politicians and by political parties, and the end result is continued misery. That's what war is all about, continued misery.
Aaron, the study estimates that the United States spent something like $1.7 trillion in these wars. Talk to us about the connection between the vast sums of money that was spent and the United States arms industry, the military-industrial complex, as it's sometimes called, as manufacturers and arms dealers as well. I mean, who really profited from these wars?
We just saw in the whole controversy over the debt ceiling that the weapons industry was pretty much the only entity in the U.S. that came out fine. The CEO of Lockheed Martin celebrated the debt ceiling deal because that would only benefit the U.S. military industrial complex's bottom line. He said this was a great outcome for us. That's who wins all the time in these military adventures. That's who won during the so-called war on terror. And, it's amazing to look back now at the congressional vote authorizing this endless use of military force around the world after 9/11. Only one member of Congress, Barbara Lee, had the courage to stand up and vote no. Only one. And that's a reflection of the jingoism that so easily takes hold in these times. It's also a reflection of just how powerful the military-industrial complex is, because that's an interest that both parties protect.
Brian, what are your thoughts on the involvement of the military-industrial complex? I mean, to what extent are these decisions actually made there? Indirectly, I mean, these are organizations which finance politicians on Capitol Hill where the political decisions are made, but to what extent are they involved?
Well, I believe the military-industrial complex and the Pentagon are actually a superior form of institutional power over the civilian government. Even the civilian congressional committees that claim to have oversight are rarely filled in on what's really going on. The last time Congress declared war, which is its constitutional mandate and obligation, was in 1941 after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And so you have these endless wars by the United States where Congress, which is the only and sole legal authority that can declare war, is actually simply a rubber stamp. And then you have more and more concentrated power such that even in the White House, in the National Security Council, and in the cabinet, you have preeminent military power. So the military-industrial complex not only succeeds, it not only gets a lot of money, it's not only incentivized by war, it exercises the dominant political power in the United States, even though we have elections every 2 or 4 years.
Saeed Khan, George W. Bush, he started the drone attacks on Pakistan, and those attacks were expanded, they were intensified by President Obama. In fact, Obama said, when he was asked about the drone strikes, he said before those strikes are approved, they must be, quote, near certainty that no civilians will be killed or injured. In reality, we know that civilians were killed and injured, many of them. What was the impact of this on Pakistan's civil society?
Well, I was in Pakistan in January, and the anti-American sentiment was palpable at all levels of that society. And so, as Khalil had mentioned before, with the survey saying that the very high number of people polled looking at America as being the biggest threat, I actually found 78% to be somewhat lower than what I would have expected. But in Pakistan, we find that this is very much an issue, and it has led to not only a series of conspiracy theories, but genuine anger regarding the United States. And here we see some other collateral damage with the recent political challenges in Pakistan. Everybody will view America as having the hidden hand behind, for example, the removal of former Prime Minister Imran Khan. So the taint of American involvement in the case of Pakistan, what had one time been a frontline ally in the Cold War, a member of both CENTO and CETO, has clearly evaporated, particularly over the last 20 years.
Khalil, I've only got about a minute left, but it is almost certain that there were alleged crimes committed during these wars. We know what happened at Abu Ghraib. We've talked about that, and Brian mentioned the CIA black sites as well. We know of the torture that took place at Guantanamo Bay. But there's been no accountability, has there, civilian or military? In fact, in some instances, President Bush awarded medals to some of the people involved, like Tommy Franks, the general in Iraq, George Tenet, the CIA leader, as well as Paul Bremer, who was the last civilian leader in Iraq during the occupation.
This is not unique to the 7 or 8 wars that we discuss. It's a universal and historical issue. Wars never really lead in the final analysis to accountability. That's the nature of the beast. They so quickly attract supporters, and then when the bullets stop flying, people just forget.
Right.
I mean, how many people today believe what we have discussed today, that the situation is even not only as bad, but even worse in Afghanistan than it was before this war?
Okay, we have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.